The governor of Arkansas thought she could lecture America on values, but in a matter of seconds, Jasmine Crockett turned the stage into her courtroom. Cameras caught it all. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, red-faced, her voice climbing into a sharp and desperate pitch, insisting she alone understood what America needed. She jabbed her finger toward Crockett, the kind of move meant to intimidate. But Jasmine didn't flinch. The room was heavy with silence, except for Sanders' escalating rant. She repeated the same tired lines about morality and family values, but every word came out thinner than the one before. It wasn't the confidence of a leader. It was the panic of someone who knew the ground beneath her was cracking. Crockett, seated across from her, was the picture of composure. Her hands rested calmly, her gaze steady, almost amused by the spectacle unfolding in front of her. Where Sanders' voice trembled with forced authority, Crockett's silence spoke louder. It was the silence of someone who knew the truth was on her side, and she didn't need to shout to prove it. People watching could feel the contrast like heat off the pavement. Sanders was unraveling, each phrase digging her deeper. Crockett simply blinked, a slight tilt of her head saying more than 1,000 interruptions ever could. And in that moment, viewers at home weren't just seeing two politicians. They were witnessing the collapse of a persona built on bluster, colliding against the steady force of dignity. Gasps rippled across the crowd as Sanders stumbled over her own words. She claimed she represented every hard-working American, yet her anger betrayed her. Every time she raised her voice, she revealed a crack in the carefully painted portrait of moral certainty. Every time she lashed out, Crockett's calm became more commanding. It was a scene no one could have scripted better. The governor, losing control in front of the nation, and the congresswoman, letting patience and quiet strength dismantle the performance without saying a word. It was the kind of clash that left audiences frozen, asking themselves, how could someone who preaches control lose it so completely, so publicly? But what sparked this meltdown was far bigger than anyone expected. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to step back and see who Sarah Huckabee Sanders has built herself to be. As governor of Arkansas, she hasn't just governed. She has branded herself as the torchbearer of traditional values, someone eager to remind the country of what she calls the moral foundations of America. In speeches, in interviews, on television, she leans heavily on the image of faith, family, and authority. For her supporters, she's a straight-talking defender of an older order. For her critics, she's a political performer, recycling the same slogans while ignoring the contradictions standing just behind her. Sanders' national ambitions aren't a secret. Every word she speaks is carefully aimed not just at Arkansas, but at the broader Republican stage. She wants to be seen as the natural heir to a movement that thrives on confrontation, a leader who doesn't blink when challenged. And yet, in this exchange with Jasmine Crockett, the mask began to slip. Because opposite her sat a woman whose rise couldn't have been more different. Jasmine Crockett has never relied on legacy or inherited influence. Her story is rooted in grit, a Texas lawyer-turned-congresswoman whose voice carries not just the authority of office, but the weight of lived struggle. Where Sanders wraps herself in slogans, Crockett grounds herself in evidence, in truth, in the unflinching experience of someone who has fought for justice both inside and outside the courtroom. That's why this clash wasn't just another political argument. It was a confrontation between two archetypes, the manufactured image of power and the hard-earned reality of it. And for millions watching, the stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't simply about which woman looked sharper on camera. It was about whether hypocrisy could still pass for leadership in America. Sanders, with her lofty rhetoric, had long avoided being pressed on the inconsistencies of her record. She could say one thing on the campaign trail and do another behind closed doors, confident that bluster and repetition would cover the gaps. But Crockett represented the nightmare scenario for that strategy. Someone unwilling to be silenced, someone who could calmly hold up a mirror and force Sanders to see what she didn't want the public to notice. That's what electrified the air in that room. Viewers weren't just watching a governor lose her temper. They were watching the idea of unchecked hypocrisy start to unravel under the weight of truth. Every second, Sanders raged. Crockett's quiet confidence made the imbalance sharper. It was a collision of two Americas, one clinging to outdated pretense, the other rising with the strength of authenticity. And as Sanders leaned harder into her performance, desperate to hold control, audiences sensed it, the shift, the unraveling, the moment the tide would turn. Crockett hadn't even spoken her most devastating line yet, but the anticipation was already building. People leaned closer to their screens, the chatter online spiking, whispers turning into roars. And yet, as cameras rolled, one line from Crockett changed everything. Sarah Huckabee Sanders has spent years carefully crafting her public image. 2. Her supporters. She is the unshakable guardian of traditional values, the daughter of a political dynasty who speaks with the certainty of inherited authority. She frames herself as a woman of faith, of family, of unwavering conviction. Every speech is laced with references to protecting the moral core of America, as though she alone has been chosen to preserve what she calls the nation's character. But beneath the surface of that polished image lies a pattern that critics know all too well. A reliance on hypocrisy as a political weapon. Time and again, Sanders has thundered against her opponents, accusing them of corruption, dishonesty, and elitism, even as her own record has raised those very same questions. She built her name on confrontation. As press secretary in the Trump White House, she became notorious for dismissing facts she didn't like, spinning obvious falsehoods into defensive talking points. She treated journalists as enemies, scoffing at accountability, deflecting with a practiced smirk. It wasn't truth she wielded, it was power, sharpened into arrogance. And when she transitioned to state politics, the style didn't change. She leaned on bluster, sure that confidence alone could paper over contradiction. Her governorship in Arkansas has been defined by that same approach. Sanders has promoted herself as the voice of hardworking families, yet her policies have repeatedly favored political allies and wealthy donors. She lectures about transparency, yet she has faced repeated criticism for shielding government spending from scrutiny. She champions freedom of speech, except when dissenting voices challenge her authority. Each stance comes with its mirror image. The values she projects outward and the double standards revealed under scrutiny. Still, she thrives on performance. Sanders knows that in today's politics, outrage can be more powerful than logic, and sound bites more enduring than truth. She has mastered the art of playing the villain's foil, accusing others of sins she herself is accused of. And in the insulated world of her base, it works. People see the daughter of Mike Huckabee, the former presidential candidate and Fox News fixture, and assume the mantle of authority was always hers to inherit. That air of inevitability became her armor and her weakness. Because when you build your career on projection, on painting yourself as the moral high ground while dismissing contradiction as irrelevant, you become deeply vulnerable to anyone who refuses to play along. In her clashes with Crockett, those vulnerabilities rose to the surface. Sanders walked into the room assuming that volume, posture, and pedigree would secure her dominance. She believed the old formula, raise your voice, double down, accuse the other side of weakness, would deliver the same results it always had. But there was something different this time, because Sanders wasn't facing a pliant journalist who could be brushed aside, nor a party opponent afraid to risk backlash. She was facing Jasmine Crockett, whose career had been built on dismantling contradictions in courtrooms, on cross-examining with precision, on exposing the gap between words and reality. And unlike the reporters Sanders used to spar with, Crockett had no interest in becoming the villain of Sanders's script. Sanders's overconfidence was her undoing. In her mind, she was untouchable, a governor with national ambitions, insulated by her base, shielded by a narrative she had polished for years. She didn't realize that her very confidence, the dismissive tone, the smirk, the raised voice, would only highlight the cracks when Crockett began to push back. That's what made this clash so cinematic. The arrogance Sanders relied on wasn't just an attitude, it was the rope she had unknowingly handed Crockett. Every contradiction in her record, every double standard she embodied, was waiting to be pulled into the open. And as her voice rose, trying to hold on to control, the stage was being prepared for her unraveling. But little did she know, Crockett had been preparing for this moment her whole life. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's composure rattled Sarah Huckabee Sanders so deeply, you have to understand where Crockett came from. Hers is not the story of political inheritance or privilege. Hers is the story of a woman who fought her way into the public eye, carrying with her the scars of struggle and the lessons of resilience. Born and raised in Texas, Crockett grew up in a world where politics often seemed designed to overlook voices like hers. She saw the gaps in opportunity, the uneven weight of justice, the constant uphill battle faced by families who worked hard yet remained unheard. Those early experiences did not make her cynical. They made her determined. Crockett carried that determination through school, through the endless grind of proving herself in spaces where people doubted her, and eventually into law, where she found her calling. As an attorney, she became a fierce advocate for those who couldn't afford high-priced representation. She defended people caught in a justice system that often punished poverty more harshly than crime itself. In courtrooms across Texas, Crockett learned how to face down intimidation, how to keep her voice steady when others tried to shout her down, how to use evidence and precision to cut through theatrics. She was never the loudest person in the room, but she was always the most prepared. It was in those legal battles that she refined the calm that would later leave Sanders so exposed. For Crockett, control was not about raising her voice. It was about knowing that facts and truth would do the heavy lifting if you gave them space to breathe. Again and again, she watched opponents unravel not because she screamed, but because she didn't. Silence, patience, and timing became her sharpest weapons. Her transition into politics was not an act of ambition, but of service. Crockett saw too many communities abandoned by leaders who promised change but delivered neglect. She saw how easily hypocrisy passed as leadership, how injustice wore the mask of law. Running for office was a natural extension of the battles she had already been fighting. And when she entered Congress, she carried with her the same courtroom discipline, the same refusal to be cowed, the same sharp focus on exposing corruption no matter where it tried to hide. Crockett's rise wasn't fueled by moneyed backers or legacy connections. It was fueled by the people she represented, everyday Texans who saw in her not just a politician, but an advocate. That authenticity made her dangerous to figures like Sanders. Because where Sanders relied on rehearsed lines and an inherited stage, Crockett relied on lived truth, and truth can't be shouted down forever. Her presence in Congress quickly drew national attention. She wasn't afraid to challenge colleagues, to call out inconsistencies, to demand accountability. But what struck observers most wasn't her volume, it was her poise. In a chamber often dominated by bluster, Crockett's ability to deliver cutting arguments with calm precision made her stand out. She didn't need theatrics, her strength was undeniable without them. That's what made her showdown with Sanders so symbolic. Sanders embodied the kind of politics Crockett had spent her career fighting against. Politics that weaponized hypocrisy, that punished dissent, that valued image over integrity. And Crockett, with the training of a lawyer and the grit of someone who had fought for every inch of ground she stood on, was perfectly positioned to meet that challenge. Audiences watching could feel it. The contrast wasn't just visual, it was spiritual. Sanders looked like someone performing authority, grasping at control with every raised octave. Crockett looked like someone who had already seen 100 versions of this act and had dismantled them all. Her stillness wasn't weakness. It was strength, sharpened by years of standing firm while louder voices tried to drown her out. This was the battle Crockett had prepared for, not on a debate stage, not in a press conference, but in the trenches of everyday justice. She knew the power of timing, the importance of restraint, the value of letting arrogance expose itself. And in that moment, as Sanders fumed and faltered, Crockett's entire journey crystallized into clarity. This wasn't just another argument. This was the living embodiment of why she had entered public life in the first place. Her story was never about seeking attention. It was about holding a mirror up to power and refusing to let hypocrisy hide in plain sight. That's why, when Sanders tried to corner her, Crockett didn't just push back. She exposed everything. The tension in the room tightened like a drawn bowstring. Sanders leaned forward, her voice sharpened to a bark, cutting across Crockett before the Congresswoman could even finish a sentence. It was classic Sanders. Dominate the stage with sheer force of volume, smother the opposition before their words could land. But Crockett didn't flinch. She let Sanders' interruption hang in the air, her own expression unchanged, her calm presence becoming more unsettling with every passing second. The audience felt it. They had seen this tactic before, the governor talking over her critics, drowning them in repetition. But this time, the tactic was unraveling. Every interruption only made Sanders look more frantic, her voice trembling on its edges. The pitch was no longer steady. It carried the desperation of someone who sensed they were losing control. Crockett, by contrast, embodied restraint. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes or wave her arms in protest. Instead, she paused, tilted her head slightly, and allowed the silence to make Sanders' bluster echo even louder. The visual contrast was striking, one woman pacing her words like a seasoned lawyer, the other firing off accusations like a panicked defendant. Gasps began to ripple from the corners of the room when Sanders stumbled, talking over herself, in a rush to cut Crockett down. Her hands sliced the air in frantic gestures, the sharpness of her movements betraying a nervous energy. Crockett's hands, folded loosely in front of her, told another story entirely. She was waiting, studying, calculating, the calm before a surgical strike. For those watching at home, the divide was unmistakable. Sanders was trying to command respect. Crockett was already commanding it. The harder Sanders pressed, the more the power shifted to her opponent. Social media clips later captured this moment frame by frame. Sanders leaning in, finger jabbing, while Crockett remained motionless, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. The tone of the exchange grew more lopsided with each passing minute. Sanders raised her voice higher, cut in faster, scrambled to redirect. But each interruption left her looking less like a leader and more like someone grasping for control. Crockett, without lifting her voice above a steady rhythm, forced Sanders to expose the very hypocrisy she thought she was concealing. By now, the crowd inside the chamber was no longer silent. Murmurs swelled into audible reactions, a sharp intake of breath when Sanders barked too loudly, a suppressed laugh when she contradicted herself in her rush. The clash wasn't just political anymore, it was theatrical, almost cinematic. And the audience knew they were watching a live unraveling. Crockett finally leaned forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Not loud, not hurried, just deliberate, weighted with the kind of certainty Sanders could never fake. The room stilled, every ear straining, every eye watching. Then came the sentence that broke Sanders completely. Crockett had waited long enough. She had allowed Sanders to interrupt, to sneer, to perform her outrage for the cameras. But now the Congresswoman leaned forward, her voice steady, her words deliberate, every syllable sharpened by years in the courtroom. "Governor," she began, her tone even, almost gentle. "You keep talking about values. But values aren't what you say into a microphone. They're what you live by when nobody's looking." The chamber went still. Sanders froze for a split second, unsure whether to fire back or let the words slide. Crockett didn't give her the choice. She pressed forward, laying out fact after fact, each one precise, each one aimed at the widening cracks in Sanders's performance. "You lecture this country about transparency," Crockett continued. Her eyes locked on Sanders. "And yet under your administration, Arkansas taxpayers can't even see where their money is going. You've hidden spending, shielded records, blocked accountability. How is that transparency?" A murmur moved through the audience. Sanders shifted in her chair, her jaw tightening. Crockett stayed calm, almost clinical, as though she were presenting a case to a jury. "You talk about protecting hardworking families," she said, her tone never rising. "But the families I've spoken to in Arkansas are working harder than ever, while your policies hand out breaks to donors and political insiders. How do you square that?" The governor tried to interject, but Crockett held up a hand, not in anger, not in frustration, but with the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to finish. The interruption died on Sanders' lips. "And then there's this," Crockett said, her voice dropping slightly, forcing everyone to lean in closer. "You call yourself a defender of freedom, but freedom doesn't mean silencing dissent. Freedom doesn't mean punishing journalists or cutting off voices that disagree with you. Freedom means letting truth stand on its own, even when it makes you uncomfortable." The chamber grew heavier, the silence thick. Crockett paused, let the weight of her words sink in. Then she delivered the line that shattered the governor's facade. "You say you represent American values," she declared, her eyes unwavering. "But the truth is, you don't even live by the ones you preach." For a heartbeat, nothing. No coughs, no whispers, no movement. Just the stunned silence of a room watching a public figure's mask slip away. Sanders opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hand fidgeted with the papers in front of her, the nervous tell of someone who had lost control. The audience caught it, the cameras caught it, the nation caught it, and then the murmurs began. Soft at first, then louder, rolling across the room like a wave. Gasps, whispers, the faintest chuckle from someone who couldn't contain themselves. Crockett had done what few thought possible. She had reduced the governor, the self-proclaimed iron defender of values, to silence. Sanders tried to rally. She raised her voice, grasping at the same lines that had carried her through rallies and interviews before. But this time, they landed flat. Every word she spoke now seemed hollow, because Crockett had stripped them of their weight. The hypocrisy had been laid bare, and no amount of shouting could cover it up. Crockett, sensing the shift, delivered the finishing blow. She leaned back slightly, her voice calm as ever. "Governor, it's not the volume of your words that proves your values. It's whether those words match your actions. And today, the country can see for themselves that they don't." The eruption was instant. Some in the chamber gasped loudly, others broke into applause before being hushed. Online, clips of the exchange were already being shared, the quote racing across timelines. Sanders sat rigid, her face tight, her composure shredded. She had been outmaneuvered, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with the simple power of truth delivered without fear. For Crockett's supporters, it was a moment of vindication. For Sanders' critics, it was confirmation of what they had long suspected. And for millions watching, it was proof that hypocrisy, no matter how loudly defended, could still be dismantled with calm, unflinching clarity. Sanders shuffled her papers again, a futile attempt to regain footing. But the optics were irreversible. The governor rattled, the congresswoman composed, the power dynamic flipped before the nation's eyes. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her restraint made the moment even more devastating. She had come to expose hypocrisy, and she had done exactly that. The audience, the cameras, the country. They all knew it. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because the fallout from Crockett's takedown didn't stop in that room. It exploded nationwide. The moment Crockett delivered her mic drop line, the tremors didn't stay confined to that room. They raced outward, carried instantly by the click of record buttons and the share buttons on millions of screens. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. By the time Sanders was still fumbling with her papers, hashtags had already started climbing on X, Twitter. Crockett v. Sanders surged to the top of U.S. trends. Within an hour, it was joined by Darker Mic Drop Moment and Acker Values Exposed. Users flooded the timeline with looping GIFs of Sanders's stunned face spliced against Crockett's calm, unflinching stare. One meme captured the mood perfectly. A split screen of Sanders yelling and Crockett smiling with the caption, "Volume isn't victory." TikTok stitched together Crockett's words with cinematic music, violins swelling as she delivered the line, "You don't even live by the ones you preach." Instagram Reels recycled the moment in a dozen creative forms. Slow-motion edits, side-by-side comparisons of Sanders' past speeches, even mashups with boxing sound effects. The internet had chosen its winner, and it wasn't the governor. Commentators rushed to weigh in. Cable news networks replayed the exchange on loop, each panel dissecting the tone, the body language, the silence that hung after Crockett's line. One anchor said, "This wasn't just a debate moment, it was a cultural moment." Crockett didn't just win the exchange, she flipped the entire frame. Late-night comedians couldn't resist. Jokes about Sanders' paper-shuffling attempt at recovery became monologue staples. One show opened with a skit titled, "When the Receipts Show Up," a parody of Sanders rummaging through empty folders while Crockett calmly sipped water. The audience roared. Celebrities chimed in, too. A-list actors, athletes, and musicians reposted Crockett's quote. One famous singer tweeted, This is how you call out hypocrisy, with dignity, not noise." Another star simply posted the clip with a fire emoji and the word "Queen." But it wasn't just entertainment figures. Politicians across the spectrum reacted. Some Democrats hailed Crockett as a rising star, calling her the new standard of political courage. Even a handful of moderate Republicans admitted, cautiously on background, that Sanders had been caught flat-footed. Conservative pundits tried to spin it, arguing Crockett had been too rehearsed or too polished. But the pushback felt hollow against the tidal wave of viral momentum. For Sanders, the night turned into a PR nightmare. Instead of clips of her owning the libs filling conservative media, she was plastered across the internet as the face of hypocrisy laid bare. Her supporters scrambled, but memes outpaced their messaging. One especially brutal viral edit cut together Sanders shouting over Crockett with the words "fragile values" flashing on screen. Meanwhile, Crockett's base erupted with pride. Supporters flooded her socials with praise. Her follower count spiked by hundreds of thousands in just days. Donations to her campaign poured in, small-dollar contributions from people who saw in her not just a politician, but a fighter who knew how to wield calm strength. And through it all, the clip kept spreading, across news outlets, across feeds, across borders. International headlines even picked it up. American lawmaker silences governor with calm, brutal takedown. In London, a political commentator compared Crockett's performance to an attorney dismantling a witness on the stand. In Canada, pundits praised her as a rare voice who can pierce through political theater. What made the moment stick wasn't just the takedown, it was how Crockett delivered it. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't mocked. She hadn't grandstanded. She had exposed hypocrisy with the precision of a scalpel, and that restraint gave the blow its force. Viewers recognized it, they felt it, and they rewarded it by amplifying it far beyond the walls of that debate hall. Sanders tried to recover with press appearances, but reporters' questions always circled back to one thing: Crockett's line. Each attempt to pivot only reminded audiences of the viral clip. Every denial, every defensive phrase made her look smaller compared to the calm authority of Crockett's words. In the span of a single night, Crockett's brand had shifted. She wasn't just the congresswoman from Texas anymore. She was a national figure, a symbol of how dignity could outlast volume, how truth could silence the loudest scream. And through the noise, one moral truth began to crystallize. When the dust of the debate settled and the viral storm began to take its course, what lingered wasn't just the sound bite or the meme. It was something deeper, a crystallizing moral lesson that reached beyond the politics of the moment. Crockett's words reframed the entire exchange. Sanders had tried to weaponize outrage, to dominate through sheer force of voice. But Crockett's calm response revealed something timeless. Truth will always cut sharper than noise. In exposing Sanders' hypocrisy without raising her own voice, Crockett reminded everyone watching that integrity isn't about volume. It's about clarity. The contrast was undeniable. On one side stood anger, bluster, and pretense. On the other stood composure, evidence, and service. Crockett didn't just answer Sanders. She modeled a better way of leading. She demonstrated that when leaders anchor themselves in truth, they don't need to shout. They don't need to perform. They simply need to stand firm, and the strength of their position speaks for itself. Audiences watching from their living rooms felt it. Parents pointed to the screen and told their kids, "This is what it means to stay calm under pressure." Young activists saw in Crockett a template for how to fight injustice without losing dignity. Even those disillusioned with politics found themselves inspired by the simple honesty of her approach. The moral clarity of the moment cut through party lines. It wasn't about Democrats versus Republicans anymore. It was about truth versus hypocrisy. About calm dignity versus reckless anger. About genuine service versus hollow performance. Crockett's response elevated the debate from a partisan clash into a universal lesson about the kind of character that deserves power. And that's why it resonated so profoundly. People weren't just clapping for Crockett's takedown of Sanders. They were clapping for the values she embodied. They were cheering for honesty, composure, and the courage to expose double standards without mirroring the very ugliness she was confronting. As one commentator put it, Crockett didn't just win the argument, she showed us what leadership looks like when it's grounded in integrity. That's the emotional crescendo this moment carried. Viewers weren't left drained by political toxicity. They were lifted by the reminder that dignity can still triumph in a public arena that too often rewards chaos. They were reminded that calm, steady truth isn't weakness. It's power in its purest form. The exchange became a turning point not because one politician embarrassed another, but because it revealed a hunger in the public for leaders who don't confuse cruelty with strength. Crockett's victory wasn't just over Sanders. It was over the cynicism that says only the loudest voices get heard. In the weeks that followed, the moral lesson of that night echoed far beyond the stage. Teachers referenced it in classrooms, preachers wove it into sermons, motivational speakers highlighted it as an example of resilience and composure. What began as a tense clash in a debate hall had blossomed into a cultural parable. When faced with hypocrisy, the strongest response isn't fury, but unshakable truth. And that's why this wasn't just a political spat. It was a turning point. When all was said and done, the story of this clash boiled down to one undeniable truth. Sarah Huckabee Sanders lost her composure, and Jasmine Crockett exposed her hypocrisy. But more importantly, everyone watching, in that debate hall and across the nation, saw that dignity can still win in American politics. This wasn't just about a soundbite or a viral clip. It was about the kind of leadership people crave, in an age of noise and division. Sanders tried to use volume and outrage to dominate, but Crockett's calm precision dismantled her without needing to shout. The audience didn't just witness a debate, they witnessed a defining moment where Composure triumphed over chaos, and honesty cut through hypocrisy like glass. And that's where the lesson lives. We don't have to accept that politics must always be toxic. We don't have to accept that anger must always drown out truth. Crockett reminded us that strength can be quiet, dignity can be powerful, and integrity can outlast even the loudest scream. Now the question becomes, what do we do with this moment? Do we let it fade into just another viral trend, or do we amplify the lesson it carries? If you believe truth should always overpower hypocrisy, share this video. Pass it forward. Let it remind others that there is another way to lead, another way to fight, another way to win. And if you want to keep amplifying voices like Jasmine Crockett's, voices rewriting America's story with courage and integrity, subscribe. Because this is bigger than one debate. This is about reshaping the culture of politics itself, one moment of dignity at a time.